Welcome to today's luncheon. We're so honored that you're here, number one. I was just speaking with someone that will remain nameless, but they said how much they enjoyed our luncheons because they're feeling that there's one place where we can have conversations where we feel we're really supported about our precious Catholic faith and our citizenry as well. The idea that we are a part of this community we know to be generally widely Chicago and Illinois, but in many ways the idea that we're able to really feel comfortable talking about the things that are so important to us, more important than anything, frankly, that this place called the Catholic Citizens of Illinois represents a spot in our lives where we can all come together and be very much more comfortable than ever, perhaps. Now we've got a lot to celebrate, I think, in many ways, and I'm hoping you would all agree with that. We've got a wonderful schedule of speakers coming up, and that information will be afforded you shortly. But for the time being, I just want to welcome you and know that being in the company of all of you is an honor and a privilege. And I'd like to start with Grace. So we're all ready. Oh, Theresa Farnan, our speaker. Oh, Father, please, where are you? Definitely. Please. Thank you.
Indeed, I've prayed once or twice before. Let's bow our heads and give the glory to thanksgiving to God in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we do give you thanks for times like these together, to contemplate, to listen, to learn. We pray especially that we may take home with us some morsels of truth and wisdom that we must share with others, that we must remember, especially for those who do not seek the great wisdom and the depth that comes from a faith such as ours. We thank for this topic and our speaker, whose father was a great friend of mine back at Notre Dame, good old father. And we pray in thanksgiving for her gifts that she'll share with us. Let's pray together. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
So while I have the motions, I'd like to say a great big
Good afternoon, everybody. We're not going to start our program yet, so please go ahead and keep eating your lunch. I just want to make a few remarks before we do get underway, and particularly, of course, in starting out about the election. Is there anyone in this room who is disappointed by the outcome? I mean, this has just been a tremendous occasion for us. But I also want to take a moment just to remind everybody that, and I'm sure you've seen this in the news, the left is gearing up to fight every step of the way, okay? And one of the first people whose remarks I saw coming out of the election was Robert Reich, the former Labor Secretary, talking about, how resistance to Trump must start now. And one of the things he mentioned, and this is why I thought it was so fortuitous that we have the speaker we do today. He says, we will protect trans people and everyone else who is scapegoated because of how they look or what they believe. No one should be ashamed of who they are. I mean, this is how they think about this stuff. Who said that transgenders should be ashamed of who they are? And what does that extend to? I mean, should Richard Speck have not been ashamed of who he was? I mean, there's some scary stuff out there. So I'm just pointing that out. And then our December speaker was to be Father Joshua Caswell, speaking on the St. John Cantius Principio, for reasons also beyond his control, and please keep eating, I just want to do this while you're eating your meal. Beyond his control, he can't appear. So that is also a reminder of the atmosphere in which we live. The third thing I'm just going to quickly remind you of, Catholic Citizens TV, which is our YouTube channel, now has over 56 videos. Father James Altman's video, which was on the subject in 2020 of how to vote, or why Catholics must vote, can't vote Democratic, has so far garnered 36,000 views. Father Paul Mankowski, now deceased, his talk for us has garnered 13,000 views. And Dr. Ellen Moy, who talked a great talk on the COVID vaccines, which may not come back up in the context of the COVID vaccines, but clearly with Robert Kennedy Jr. in the administration, we're going to hear a lot about vaccines. He's garnered over 1,200 views. So I just remind you that these are all out there. This video will be, the talk today will be posted on our video, and the annual banquet with Kevin Wells and Sister Deidre Byrne is about to be posted. So at your convenience and whenever you want to look at that, it's Catholic Citizens TV on YouTube. So, all right, go ahead and finish your lunch, and we'll start with the speaker momentarily. Thank you. Well, I've just been advised by our speaker she'd really like to get underway because she really has a lot to talk about, and that's a very hard request to ignore or minimize. So I think we are going to go ahead and introduce the speaker, but please continue to eat your lunch, and including, I guess, the dessert even is coming around. Theresa Farnan, Ph.D., is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, currently focusing on the challenges. Thank you. Yeah, no one kiss. Just, well, if you want to, you can. As part of the Person and Identity project at that center, she's the co-author of 2 books. The first one called Get Out Now, Why You Should Pull Your Children from Public Schools Before It's Too Late. And the second called Where Did I Come From, Where Am I Going, How Did I Get There? Ms. Farnan has taught at St. Paul Seminary in Pittsburgh, the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and Mount St. Mary's Seminary, and has worked with the diaconate formation program for the Dioceses of Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. She has also served as a consultant of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family, Life, and Youth, and is a member of the Catholic Women's Forum Advisory Council. Ms. Farnan has lectured widely on gender ideology, Catholic education, theology of the body, the personalism of Pope John Paul II, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the vocation and dignity of women. She hosted the St. Thomas Aquinas in Today's World on EWTN television. She received her master's degree and her doctorate in medieval studies from the University of Notre Dame, and she and her husband Michael have 10 children. Please extend a warm Catholic salute in Illinois. Welcome, Theresa Farnan.
You know, usually when someone mentions that I have so many children, it's an anomaly, but in this crowd, this seems to be sort of, the status quo. So I'm going to take the microphone off, if I can, okay? So I can see my slides, and yes, I brought slides because I'm here to ruin your lunch. So, without further, I also want to mention, I know there are a lot of people in this room who knew my father, Charles Rice, and it is just, I can't tell you how much I love meeting you. So, those of you who have mentioned it to me, you've made my day, you've made my weekend, you've made my month. So my topic today is to talk about gender ideology, but to take a different tactic. And what I really want to emphasize is where the church has been on this issue, because we get a lot of negative press about this because the media is constantly, as my teenagers would say, gassing up Father James Martin and people like that. But I will say the church's response on this issue, we have been leading the charge. And in some ways, I felt from 2016 on, I had the sense that it was like 1974, and the only people speaking up in a consistent, systematic way on the pro-life issue were Catholics, the Catholic Church, leaning in and having clear statements. And that's where we are on the transgender issue, because so many of the other churches don't have the systematic theology to lean into it, and so many secular organizations were simply afraid and really didn't have the resources. So let's take a step back in time to 2012, where and we'll go back to Pope Benedict XVI, okay? Actually 2011. So the image on the far right is Pope Benedict speaking to the German parliament. And this is an address, if you have a chance to read it, it's a fantastic address. Those of you who are lawyers, he talks about the influences of legal positivism, which we know was such a huge, tremendous issue with the Second World War and paving the way for the Nazi regime. So it's a very thoughtful commentary on that. But towards the end, he talks about how once you ascribe to legal positivism, you put yourself in a situation where anything goes in terms of human nature. In other words, the boundaries are no longer ethics. The boundaries then become, we start questioning even the nature of the human person. And in his very thoughtful, scholarly, quiet way, Pope Benedict comments on the fact that he really sees the environmental movement. Now this is challenging because we think of the environmental movement as sort of being pushed through and fused with Marxism, but he sees the environmental movement as a hook, as an opportunity to reach out to young people and to make the point to them that man also has a nature. That the human person, just as there's an ecology of the environment, there's an ecology of the person. And the ecology of the person includes the family, it includes the nature of the human person as a unity of body and soul, right? So it's a wonderful address. And again, he's mentioning it in the context of ideological deconstruction of the person. Then in 2012, he gave a barn burner of an address at the Curia, his Christmas address to the Curia, where he, in the course of this conversation, he lights up on gender ideology. And he calls it out as an alternate anthropology that deconstructs the nature of the person and is an offense against God the Creator. Now, 2012, how many of us were even aware that this was an issue, right? Were you even thinking about it? I know you were, I was. But I mean, most people were not even thinking about it. If it percolated at all, it was, a very niche issue that didn't seem to affect any of us. And yet, nevertheless, did you do that or did I do it? Oh, good, perfect. And yet, nevertheless, Pope Benedict was out in front of our culture, calling out the problem with gender ideology. So then let's fast forward to Pope Francis, right? Pope Francis's pontificate has been marked by two themes, right? On this issue. The first theme is the Pope Francis we read about in the New York Times. Accompany people, never abandon them, making gestures, always welcoming in, during the synod, he met with a group of transgender identifying Catholics, right? And just always bring them in. Well, that's the only side of Pope Francis that you read about with the media. However, okay, that does not do justice to Pope Francis's approach on this issue. Because Pope Francis is on record time and again calling out what he refers to as gender ideology, which he refers to as one of the most dangerous ideological colonizations. He uses the word wicked to describe it. He calls it an enemy of the family. And so in this way, in his own way, he's trying to walk the line. He sees a suffering group of people, and yet he still is walking that line, putting himself hand in hand with or in lockstep with Pope Benedict on this issue. In fact, most of his statements on this issue, he quotes Pope Benedict. He will refer to conversations that they had on this issue, and he has never backed down on the ideological problems with the issue of gender ideology. So what is the problem, and what does the church have to contribute to this? Well, I work with a lot of secular groups on this issue. A lot of people who are concerned about men and women's sports or about some of the woke ideology going into schools, or parents whose children have been harmed or wounded by this. And the one thing that's striking about it is that while they can diagnose the ill effects, it's almost like they're the clinician who can identify that the patient indeed is sick, right? And they can even treat some of the symptoms, but they still don't understand the underlying issue. And that is the unique contribution of the Catholic Church on this. Now, the Catholic Church in the Compendium of Social Doctrine, which is really, I think, an underutilized resource. It's this massive resource that goes through all these issues. In the Compendium of Social Doctrine, the Church insists that if a culture does not get the question of what it means to be a human person right, that culture is going to go off the rails. That is a culture that is going to be inhumane. It is going to lose its humanity, and the most vulnerable people will be harmed. And so, the compendium makes the point that we're opposed to any kind of reductionist or ideological perspective on the human person. Now, anthropology is the theology and philosophy word meaning the study of the person, what we understand to be true about the person. So right there, when we look at a culture, we should be asking not only like, what do we see on the surface, but push a little bit deeper. What does this say about the human person? Well, what does Christian anthropology have to say about the person? I know I don't need to belabor this with it's nice to speak to like, a Catholic audience that really knows their faith. So I don't need to explain this to you, but I will actually just highlight some of the key points for our purposes today, which is that we do talk about identity. We live in a culture obsessed with identity. We know that we have an identity. Our identity is you are a son or a daughter of God, right? You are a person who is a unity of body and soul, embodied as either male or female. Your dignity is not something granted by the state. It comes from that relationship with God. And we can talk in a meaningful way about human nature, that human beings are designed in such a way that we can talk about what is good for the person and what is harmful for the person, what is good for the family, what is harmful for the family. And so we can see there are all kinds of ripple effects then in terms of how we understand the family, how we understand human sexuality, what we believe to be true about the nature and limits of political authority, and things such as, and this is a key one, our understanding that the Catholic Church right now is the only one defending in a systematic way the idea that there's intrinsic meaning and order to the human body, right? Far from being the prudes who are like repressed and prudish about sex and the body, the Catholic Church has consistently been saying sex is something that exists for a unitive and procreative purpose, and your body has meaning and is intrinsically good, right? We see this reflected in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Here are some of the key points. I want to point out, even back in the 1990s, the Catholic Church was using the term sexual identity. Now, the first time I read that, I thought, well, that's a weird word. That's a weird, a weird phrase to use to express this. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Because what it's saying is that your identity is inseparable from your embodiment as male or female. So even in the 1990s, when the Catechism of the Catholic Church was published, the church was ahead on this issue, insisting you are that unity of body and soul. And so we as a church understand that when you think about what the soul is the first principle of life, right? It's what makes a body living rather than dead. It's, when people ask me, like, how do you explain it? I would say it's like, if the soul is the form of the body, it's sort of the dynamic force giving, or the dynamic power sort of giving it organization and helping to organize and direct growth and reproduction and everything else. So we know we have a soul. It's important to see, though, that God creates us with a human soul rather than a gendered male or female soul. You are a person who is either male or female, but you're male or female because you have a human soul joined at the moment of conception with either a male or female body, right? And so we know men and women are different, right? We know men and women are different not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Why? Because as a woman, as a young girl, you're growing up and your life is marked by the experience of being embodied as female. Similarly with men, and this is one of the reasons why with the transgender movement, it's so insulting when somebody adopts the persona of a woman and then starts talking about things like breaking the glass ceiling. You have no idea. You have no idea what it's like to be a mother, to be pregnant, to be, all of the things that women go through, and women can't understand what men are going through. I have girls and boys, and it's so funny to hear the conversations, including one conversation at one point. Someone read a study that said that men can sit there and think of absolutely nothing, right? Like just not even thinking, and it just blew my daughters. My daughters were like, that is not possible. I'm telling you right now, that is not possible. And so when they tried it, they were sitting there thinking about nothing. It's like, I can't do it. I can't shut down. It doesn't work, right? All right. We know as humans, as human beings, the church insists that there is a nature to the human person, meaning that we are created with God's natural law imprinted on our hearts, and it influences how we live, how we develop, how we understand the family. And this is what enables us to look at certain cultural events or things going on in our culture and say, that's conducive to human flourishing, that's going to help us be better as human beings, it's going to help our family, or that is harmful. It enables us to know the truth about the person and to help guide our young people to know the good, okay? All right, this is supported by science. A lot of times you'll hear people talking about sex as a spectrum. That's absolute nonsense. How do we know that sex is binary? Because there are only two reproductive cells, male or female. End of story, right? There is no third reproductive cell. There is no third participant needed to create another human being. Well, okay, male, female, mother, father, God, right? But other than that, right? Like there's no third type of gamete. You are either male or female. It's determined at conception, observed in utero, or at birth, and immutable. And your sex is written on every single cell of your body. And we know that. We've known that for generations. But we have, like in medicine, remember when they suddenly realized that women had different heart attack symptoms, right? Like that was the big revelation in the 1990s, and when they started to wear red for women, for Women's Heart Health Month. Why was that? Because at some point someone realized that they weren't accounting for the difference between the sexes when they were doing research on heart attack symptoms. And so the only heart attack symptoms they were recording were male symptoms, pain in the left arm, whereas women would go into the emergency room complaining about indigestion, and then they would be sent home with antacids and be dead from a massive heart attack, right? That's what happens when you ignore the reality of the sexed body and the reality of sex in the person. Even Richard Dawkins, who is like not at all in any way, shape, or form Christian, although he sort of styles himself as wanting to be culturally Christian adjacent because he likes our customs and recognizes that if Christianity is not around, we lose civilization. Even someone like Richard Dawkins recognizes, like, this is insane. There are only two sexes, male or female. We live in a culture now, though, that is telling our children that who you are is determined by stereotypes, preferences, and interests. And so I always, every time I give a talk, I put this chart up. This was a chart done by an endocrinologist, a psychologist, and someone who was just a researcher on this whole issue of how young people identify. And this author made the point that if you take all the traits in a person, you're gonna see that there are some girls who are very, very girly, right? They're like scrapbooking from the time they're 4, right? And they always are neat and perfect artists and everything else. And then there are some girls who are, like tomboys. That's the word we used to call them, who are a little bit more tomboyish in their presentation, or maybe they have atypical interests, and they're going to be that little purple dot. And I always look at this chart, when I'm speaking to young people, I always tell them, I was that purple dot here. The end, the far end, on the boyish end of the female personality profile. Why? Because when I was in 6th grade, I lived in pants. I didn't even own a skirt, right? I was so active. I did sports. I played with my brothers. I would follow my father around, right? Like, I was that girl. I used to read a lot. I kept my hair short because it was just easier. I was a total tomboy. And thank goodness no one said to me, hey, you know, maybe you're a boy, right? Because I wasn't. I was just like a girl who liked to play sports and wanted to be comfortable and you know, just adored being around her father and her brothers, right? And but unfortunately now these girls who are in that little purple area, they're being told that they may possibly be transgender. Well, now we live in a time that Pope John Paul II called out in Fides et Ratio in 1998. He called out our age as the age of postmodernity, right? Where he identified that our culture in important ways, and this was the reason why he had to write Fides et Ratio, our culture is moving it's moving into an irrational stage where there is no truth, where there is no meaning. And so human beings are being asked to live in this culture where there's no certainty. You can't say anything is true about the person. You can't talk about ethics. And we certainly see this reflected now in our culture with everything that's going on. Postmodernism is the philosophical, it's really like an anti-philosophy, but it's the successor to modern philosophy. And the underlying belief, the overarching, if I were to characterize it and sum it up, I would say the core of postmodernism is the assertion that there is no truth. And the assertion that you can't come up with what they call meta-narratives. And a meta-narrative is the way you discuss and understand meaning in the world, right? So when you look at the world around you, you make sense of things, and we're able to have conversations because we sort of look at it and then we can share a discussion about, you know, what does this mean? Is this true? Is this good for us? Well, postmodernism rejects that and instead espouses this belief that there is no overarching truth. There is no overarching meta-narrative. All there are local truths. You have your truth, I have my truth. I'm from Pennsylvania. Things are true in Pennsylvania that are not true in Chicago. And we're all supposed to accept that, right? And the one thing you can't do is you can't judge someone else's truth. Because once you judge someone else's truth, you have imposed a meta-narrative on them. So remember, I said every age has an anthropology, and we judge a culture by their anthropology. Well, if we're in this postmodern culture, the anthropology of postmodernism is gender ideology, because everybody gets to define for him or herself, their self, however you want to describe it, they get to define their own meaning and reality. You create yourself. And we see this reflected in the impulse or the intentional effort to quote unquote queer the culture. I am old enough to remember when the term queer was derogatory. It is not derogatory anymore. It's been proudly embraced. And it describes an effort to, as they put it, subvert, deconstruct, problematize, and disrupt the nuclear family, heteronormativity, and even any attempt to say there's any human nature at all. Instead, what we're supposed to believe is that all of this is just mere performance, and you get to choose for yourself what story you want to perform. And this, and not coincidentally, is why drag has taken off. Because in drag, the whole point of drag is that you engage in a performance that subverts heteronormativity, meaning like an understanding of the human person as male or female, because you go out there in this exaggerated outfit with exaggerated mannerisms, right? And everyone is in on the joke. Everyone knows that it's a man being a woman, because being a woman is just a performance or a costume that you put on and take off at will. And that's the point of drag. This is why, and the whole point here with queering the culture is they're reaching down to younger and younger ages. And that is intentional. Make no mistake about it. Drag Queen Story Hour is the intentional effort to disrupt and deconstruct our children's natural knowledge of the family and the human person. And so you'll see on all these YouTube channels, we'll see shows like this, Queer Kids Story Hour, where you have a non-binary identifying performer who's up there explaining to the little teddy bear, well, Teddy, today we're going to talk about being non-binary. For audiences intended as young as 2. And you see it here. This is, you want an image that represents the queering of the culture? This is it, right? That was the whole point of this image at the Olympics. It was an intentional effort to mock, to deconstruct, to subvert an icon, our not just iconic, our foundational meta-narrative, right? Which is, our meta-narrative is like Jesus Christ is our Savior. At the Last Supper, he gave us the Eucharist and then went off and suffered and died for our sins. That's queering of the Last Supper. That is, and it's intentional. It's intentional. Before the backlash about this, all of the performers were posting, hey, we're reenacting, this is our Last Supper tableau. We're reenacting this. And also, and I don't think it's in here, that tableau included a performer in drag with his genitalia exposed standing next to a child. You can see still images of that scene. Horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. But of course, they can't do the queering of the culture without having a child in the midst of the scene. It is intentional. This is an intentional effort to subvert the culture. We can see this, we can trace this back to the sexual revolution, right? So people like Shulamith Firestone, even in the 1970s, were saying, hey, we need to separate reproduction from how we understand human sexuality, and we want to eliminate the concept of sex itself, right? Judith Butler, we're going to discuss, it's not just that gender is a performance, sex is a performance. And she denies the reality of the sexed body. Here's Martine Rothblatt, tech guru, billionaire. He's one of the big donors to the transgender movement. And he argues that this is freedom. It's freedom to be able to change your genitalia. And this is not, transgenderism for him is the stepping stone to a new transhumanism, where we can deconstruct and redefine the person. And so we can see in 1996, this small group of people, never underestimate small groups of people, probably, like 2 tables worth of people in this room, met in Texas to draw up an international bill of gender rights. And it included the statement that you had a right to define your gender identity, right? So they draw up this statement. It looks like nothing's gonna come of it. This is, when you look at the statement, it's exactly what's codified into law now. So it's been a deliberate attempt dating all the way back to the 1990s to subvert and deconstruct the human person because of postmodernism. Well, this is why when you look at Veritatis Splendor, right, again, written in the 1990s, Pope John Paul II identifies one of our key problems as the problem with the understanding of freedom, right? Where freedom, which claims to be absolute, ends up treating the human body basically as raw material that you can do with whatever you want in accord. It has no meaning until you decide to confer a meaning on it. That's what freedom is for our culture. And John Paul II called it out. Now, I remember when I first read Veritatis Splendor, that passage actually leapt off the page to me. But it didn't leap off the page to me because of the transgender issue. It's because this is exactly what's going on with contraception. This is exactly what's going on with abortion. I mean, you can't separate any of these movements, because the whole point of contraception is to flatten and minimize sexual difference and to take women, remove their fertility, remove their reproductive capacity or reproductive powers, and instead insist on the freedom to create for yourself the ability to turn off or turn on this aspect of the human body at will. Right? So we could take this passage, we could apply it to contraception, we can apply it to so many things going through our culture. Think about IVF and those poor little babies frozen in cryotherapy. Well, everyone just calls them, they're just the embryos, right? They're the embryos, sort of like this product of IVF. Well, what's an embryo? It's a person, right? But you never hear anyone actually coming to terms with exactly what we're doing. The origins of gender ideology are just hideous. They originated, the first person to push this idea that gender was a social construct and you could change someone's sexed body in accord with their gender identity. The first person was John Money, who was a fraud and a charlatan, who took a very, a case study involving two twin boys, one of whom had had a circumcision that was botched. So John Money took this very vulnerable family in the midst of just an awful, awful circumstance, assured the parents that they could just raise their son as a girl, and then began to write journal articles proclaiming what a success it was. The reality could not have been any different, right? He would write in his research articles, Brenda, that was the name the parents ended up giving to this little boy. Brenda sits there playing with her dolls, daintily smoothing her dress. You know, her hair is neat, she's wearing lace ribbons, blah, blah, blah. And the reality was this boy, this young boy, was at school getting into fistfights and trying to play with cars and couldn't keep his clothes clean. And the teachers were sending letters home to the parents saying, we don't understand this. This Brenda is just, she's not behaving like you would expect a girl to behave. So finally, when he was 14, the family told him. He reclaimed his sexual identity, but unfortunately, he and his brother had been so damaged by the experiment, because when they would go down to John Money's office, he would have them engage in sex play on each other in order to confirm this gender identity in this boy. So his brother died of a drug overdose, and he committed suicide. Absolute tragedy. This is the index case, right? Should we be surprised that these kids are suffering? Now John Money didn't have these charts. Now we have these helpful charts. Now I was at a teacher training, and one of the other presenters put this chart up, and he said, "What do you think about when you see this?" And one of the teachers, the first comment from these Catholic school teachers was, "That's targeting children. That is definitely designed to capture the attention of children." Absolutely true. So what is the point of these charts? This is the genderbread person. This is one of the graphics that's handed out by USAID. The other one is the gender unicorn. They decided to do the gender unicorns for the trans activists because they thought the genderbread person looked a little male, right? It looked a little too sexed. And so they came up with the gender unicorn. Now the whole point of this is that this is think of it as a catechetical tool that is designed to teach an anthropology to children. You take a child in a kindergarten classroom or, in comprehensive sex education and hand them this chart and say, this is how you understand who you are, and only you can tell us who you are. And how do you know who you are? Well, you look at the person and you break the person into various dimensions. Right? So to understand yourself, you've got all these little aspects to your personality, and none of it is unified, right? So the most important thing is your gender identity. Now, I have given so many talks where people will start challenging me on this, and I'm like, tell me, what is a gender identity? And they're sort of fumbling because they think it's science-y. It's like, oh, it's this thing that some people have. I'm like, well, push a little deeper. Do you want to know how the ACLU and Human Rights Campaign define it? And they're like, yeah, I'd love to hear that. Well, they define it as your self-perception. That is what your gender identity is, how you perceive yourself, how you think about yourself, right? So whenever you hear gender identity, substitute self-perception, because then it's very easy to see that we should not be allowing children to make irreversible, harmful decisions on the basis of their self-perception, right? Like, we would never allow that, right? If I had a son or daughter who was 5 years old who perceived himself to be Superman, should I open the window and let him jump out? No, that would be parental malpractice. The next category, gender expression, that's where 6th grade me would be labeled as transgender, because my gender expression, according to these charts, was male. I like to wear pants, my hair was short, I like to play with my brothers. And then the third category, which is so crucial in pushing this movement forward, is the category sex assigned at birth. We hear this everywhere. What is the point of sex assigned at birth? It teaches children to disassociate from their bodies. Because if you tell a child that their sex was assigned to them at birth, the implication is, well, this is what someone says about you, but it might not be true. And so as soon as you ask a child, what is your sex assigned at birth, you're planting that seed of doubt, like, well, maybe I'm not actually male. And you're also conveying the message that your body doesn't tell you anything about who you are. You're in this meat suit, and it might look a certain way, but the true self, your authentic self, is deep down inside. And so you have to burrow into yourself and become introspective and start looking for clues based on stereotypes. And then they throw in sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And honestly, I can't tell you how many of these young people I've talked to who are, they might be on antidepressants, they're struggling with depression, anxiety. They have no sexual attraction. Why? Because they're depressed, or they're extremely anxious. They can't even collect their thoughts. So then they get this category and they're like, oh no, I might be asexual. No, you're not. You're just a child who is struggling with depression. You need to just calm down. Don't put that pressure on yourself, right? So all of this leads us to, when you start looking at it, you can see it's a very different anthropology. Who am I? I am my own creation. What is my identity? It's whatever I choose for myself. There's no human nature. There's no necessary relationship with the body and the soul. The body exists as a type of canvas for you to project your identity to the outside world. And so, what gender clinics will say to these children, and they're all ripple effects on everything else, what gender clinics will say to these children is they will say, I will help you bring your body into alignment with your gender identity. Which is like the most radical restructuring of the meaning and purpose of medicine. It's horrifying. And at the end of the day, what we have is this deep dualism running through our culture, where we no longer believe in the unity of the person. We think, literally, that the person is a soul, a male or female soul, parked in a body that might or might not be the appropriate one. That is the underlying message. And this is the catechesis being given to our kids, not only in comprehensive sex education classes, but as soon as you start, you're in Illinois. Illinois has LGBTQ requirements all throughout the curriculum. So they're getting a constant drumbeat of this kind of messaging. I just came from Michigan. In the state of Michigan, the Department of Education has said, we're going to be amplifying these LGBT clubs and groups, right? So pushing this forward to children that you might have a transgender identity, and at the same time, policing language. So you have the graphic, the gender identity graphic, but in order to help catechize, but the other thing that you will notice when you start looking at the groups promoting this, the first thing they do is they give a glossary. That is the first thing they do. It is a catechism. This is an anthropology, and they are aggressively catechizing our children in it, policing them in the language, right? How many kids will talk about cis or trans? How many kids will talk about sex assigned at birth? How many kids, even like well-meaning Catholic kids, will say, well, I don't want to misgender somebody. Well, it's like, what does that even mean? How many kids will talk about gender identity instead of your sexual identity? So you have like this absolute irrationality of medical organizations talking about bodies with vaginas or bodies with this part, bodies with that part. They can't bring themselves, and it's always women who are denigrated by this. They can never bring themselves to use the word women, right? They'll talk about pregnant people rather than pregnant women. It's just unbelievable. And so what you see is you will see this language reflected in the assertions these young people are making about themselves. They really believe this. They believe this because this is what has been handed to them as a belief system for how to make sense of who they are, right? And so one of the whistleblowers for the Children's Hospital in St. Louis mentioned, one of the anecdotes she tells is that she had a 12-year-old girl who came in, who was on puberty blockers, and then when she was, shortly thereafter, because it's never a long period of time, right? They will tell you, oh, it's a careful examination. Baloney. So then she was put on testosterone. And the next week she called the clinic and said, when do I start making sperm? And the clinician, this was one of the reasons why this woman became a whistleblower, because she was all in on the trans ideology until she started seeing these stories. Kids would come in identifying as an attack helicopter, and they would walk out with cross-sex hormones. Just unbelievable. But they're being led to believe that this is the truth about the person. And so you can see, at its heart, and this is the key insight that we as Catholics can offer to our culture. It is a redefinition of what it means to be a human person. And when you line up these two ideologies, point by point, there is no compatibility. This is an absolute clash of two incompatible ways of looking at the person. There is no way to reconcile this, which is why you see Pope Francis, who I think his impulse is always to be with a marginalized person, but he is looking at it saying, like, this is an ideology and it's a doozy, it's a bad one. Well, if we say that anthropology is how we understand a culture, and as Catholics, we look at human nature, we understand that there's a right and a wrong for the person, right? There are certain actions that lead to human flourishing, certain actions that don't. We look at Christian anthropology as a blueprint for how to be happy. The other side will say to us, like, you don't want these kids to be happy, you don't have their best interests at heart. So let's look at the evidence. Who's right? Who's right? If we have two incompatible anthropologies, one is going to help children and one is going to harm children. This is the test case. The first thing you have to do is clear out any kind of misconception about the whole intersex category. Because intersex, it's another word for disorder of sexual development. These are kids who have a problem with their development of their reproductive organs that can be diagnosed in an objective way with labs, with clinical observation, or with imaging. And then you treat the body to restore health to it. But that's not who we're talking about. Because with these kids who are coming forward for claiming that they're transgender identifying, they have a healthy body and they're experiencing mental distress. Okay? This is the DSM-5. This is how they describe the criteria for being able to diagnose whether or not someone is experiencing quote-unquote gender dysphoria. For children who are under the age of 12, you would have to meet 6 of these criteria. For anyone over the age of 12, you only have to meet 2 of these criteria. Only 2 of them. And look at the categories. It's all desires and preferences. It comes back to, again, the stereotypical ideas. What do you like to play with? How do you like to wear your hair? But even there, this is a little misleading because it looks like there's some kind of criteria that they're using to diagnose that. But actually, that's not the case. Hold on, here we go, let me go to this slide. Because here's the head of the gender clinic at Lurie Children's Hospital here in Chicago, right? Who was captured on a Zoom workshop admitting, parents will say to me, are you sure? Are you sure my child is trans? And he said, so I turn to the child and say, what gender identity do you have? And that's dispositive. We don't need to do imaging. The child says they're transgender. End of story. Case closed. That's the diagnostic procedure. There's a lawsuit pending right now in Massachusetts against Boston Children's, and it's, you know, kind of a complicated one involving a clinician. But one of the things she's alleging is that when they initially started with a gender clinic, they would do 20-hour assessments. Do you know how long the assessments are now? 2 hours. 2 hours. That's it. So in the past, this would have been a population of children, this was vanishingly rare. 0.002% of the population. You would include some of the adult males who identify as women. That's a separate case, autogynephilia. There's like sexual arousal from dressing as a woman. But again, that's not, when our culture thinks about transgenderism and the hook that's being used to push this through is the trans kid, quote unquote, right? So, well, okay, what about children? There were children in the past who would have identified as transgender. They tended to be very young males, okay? And the story would often involve a problem with a family dynamic. So let me give you an example. There was a journal article I read from the 1990s, mother, father, a 3-year-old son, and then an infant baby girl, right? Happy family, everything's going well. Then the baby girl dies of SIDS, right? The family is plunged into grief. The dad withdraws and immerses himself in work. The mom is inconsolable. So here's this 3-year-old boy. And to fix the situation, he tells his parents he's a girl. Because in his mind, well, my sister died and they're sad because they don't have their girl, so I will be their girl. Now, thankfully, it was the 1990s, and so rather than putting this child through a full-on transition, they did grief counseling for the entire family and put the dynamic back on track and saved that family, right? That is how this would have been treated in the past. They would have used something called watchful waiting, which would mean you look at what's going on with this in this child's life and try to help them through whatever stresses are leading this child to claim this. But that's not happening now. And in fact, the population now has changed dramatically because it's no longer young boys. Now it's mostly teenage girls, some teenage boys, a lot of kids who are on the autism spectrum, kids who are showing up with psychological distress from many other things, all kinds of adverse childhood experiences. In the past, by puberty, 80% of these kids would have resolved any kind of confusion about their sexual identity. By the time they were in their 20s, almost all of them would have resolved it. Now that we started using the gender affirming care model, only 3% resolve it. So we've altered the course of this disease. And now I always caution people, that doesn't, when you say that, like say 94% of them would have resolved this distress by their early 20s, that doesn't mean that there's 6% of people who are transgender. What that means is there you have someone who's struggling with comorbid mental health issues and who just needs more time and support, right? Their issues are ongoing, okay? Some of these kids are really struggling with some really serious stuff, okay? The way to think about the medical model is it's like a set of dominoes, right? Where once you begin affirming a child, you set in motion a chain of events that's very hard to walk back. And we see this reflected in the numbers. After social transition, 5 years in, almost 98% of these kids still identify as transgender. When they go on puberty blockers, almost 100%, in some studies it has been 100% of these kids will go on to cross-sex hormones because they're being told, like, try this one will work. Oh, you don't feel like you're really, like you're still not happy? Try this step, try this intervention. There's always something until they run out at the end, right? And at the end, after they've irreparably harmed their body, there's nothing else. There's nothing else. And that's when it gets really hard for these young people, because the hope is gone. So social transition, the way to think of it is it's a psychological intervention. It is a psychosocial intervention that cements a child's identity. And that's why we see these numbers where 97.5% of these children remain transgender. Think about it. You have a little kid who is struggling with confusion about their identity, and they say, I am, say it's a little boy, I am a girl. And suddenly all the adults around him say, yes, you're right. You are a girl. Let's put you in the girl line. We're going to let you dress like a girl. Everyone is expected to treat you like a girl. I'll make sure everyone treats you like a girl, right? How is that child going to walk that back? Some of the saddest cases, there was the child who was on the cover of National Geographic's Transgender Tipping Point cover was a boy who took the name Avery, and the mom and dad went really into activism. Well, when you look at this child 10 years later, this is a kid who as a teenager will say, this ruined my life. And now his thing is he's backing away from it. He now says he's non-binary, and there's video of the family. Mom's like, well, we have to go to the trans demonstration. He's like, I don't want to go. This ruined my life, right? Because it's so hard to back out of this once you've started putting yourself down that path. The next step at Tanner stage 2, which is 11 for many kids, by the age of 11 or 12, they put these kids on puberty blockers like Lupron. Well, I mean, there are all these class action lawsuits every couple of years by girls who were put on Lupron for precocious puberty who developed osteoporosis in their 20s. This is a really powerful, dangerous drug. And these kids are on it for far longer than they should be on it, right? And so, they claim that it's safe and reversible because it's been used in precocious puberty, but we have no idea what the effects of Lupron are when you use it on a healthy body. We literally have no idea. And then after that, right? So then here's this child frozen in this like 11-year-old prepubescent state, and all of this child's peers go through puberty. So now this child's really at odds with the kids in his class, right? So what's the next step? Well, then they offer them cross-sex hormones. Estrogen for boys, testosterone for girls. And again, the claim is like, no, this is perfectly safe, but it's not. We know it's not. We know it causes irreversible changes in the body, genital atrophy. A lot of these girls, even if they don't get quote unquote bottom surgery or genital surgery, still end up having hysterectomies because testosterone wrecks their body, right? They are in so much pain as 20-year-olds. There are all kinds of health risks here, and we don't even know what the long-term consequences are. I mean, women, the controversy was, should women go on low-dose estrogen once they pass menopause? We're taking boys, teenage boys, and putting them on high-dose estrogen. How is that ever anything that is okay? It is incomprehensible. They're on high doses because the point is to overwhelm the natural state, the natural function of the body, and force the body to begin to develop secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex. It doesn't change your sex, but a boy will grow breasts and a girl will grow facial hair. It's just shocking. You can get these mail order, you get them at Planned Parenthood. During the pandemic, they're handing out the prescriptions, with like minimal diagnosis. You can get letters of medical necessity for all these procedures online from someone who has never met you. Like it's shocking. The malpractice is just shocking. And then following that, or sometimes in the midst of this, these kids will opt for surgery to quote unquote bring their body into alignment with their gender identity. Double mastectomies for girls. Now, why would a girl get a double mastectomy? Because the first part of social transition for girls is they will go out and get a binder, which is like the most restrictive garment. You put it on and it absolutely flattens your breasts, right? It causes rib fractures, back pain, difficulty breathing, they pass out. And so of course, these girls are like, oh, this binder is awful. I need to have top surgery. It is, and they're doing it as young as the age of 13, even 12 in some medical centers. Genital surgeries to fashion, which basically sterilize or castrate these young kids, and then they fashion a facsimile of the opposite sex. All of this is so harmful, just like the complication rate is off the charts. These are absolute butchers. This is a girl, she's at the office of a gender surgeon in Miami, who is infamous for putting for advertising on TikTok to these kids. So when you read this woman's if you follow her TikTok account, you'll see in the comment section all these like teenage girls saying, "Oh, you're amazing. I want you to do my top surgery." Because they're basically fangirling. She's like blonde and, you know, very cosmopolitan looking. Well, why would somebody do this? Do not underestimate the manipulative power of the line that is being used on parents and kids. Because these clinicians will literally say, and we know this because we have the reports from families who've gone through this, they will say, would you rather have a live daughter or a dead son? That is the manipulative line that is used to convince parents to fall in line and comply. The other thing is the fear that their child is going to be taken away. Well, it's not just the parents being manipulated by this, it's the kids. Because the kids hear this and they think, I need to have this treatment or I will commit suicide. But there is no evidence, right? The founders, so these gender doctors, Laura Edwards Leeper founded the first gender clinic, and she wrote an article in 2021 saying, like, we really need to dial back the suicide talk. There is no evidence that this is going to cause suicide. We have research coming out of the UK pointing out that in the waiting list for the socialized medicine healthcare in the UK, there were almost no suicides. Right? Like anyone is a tragedy, but this was extremely rare, right? And in addition, we can see from some of the research signals coming out of Europe that what we find is that suicide continues to occur. It doesn't solve these kids' problems. Why is that? Well, with the reality of what's going on is this is a young person who is hurting, who is struggling, who is trying to escape some pain or confusion in their lives. And so this can be understood as a maladaptive response to very real pain. When you look at the research, you can see that these are young people who 88% of them show up at the gender clinic already having been diagnosed with a mental health issue. And these are serious issues. Childhood traumas, parents with mental health issues, depression, anxiety. Over a third of them are on the autism spectrum, right? Sexual abuse, experience in the foster care system. Now the evidence for this is so low, and the increasing evidence that this is harmful to kids is so compelling that we're seeing overseas, European countries walking this back. Right? So the UK, for instance, commissioned the CAS review, and they ended up closing the Tavistock Clinic, which was the clinic where most of the all of the gender transitions were taking place in the UK. Finland also stopped doing them, just completely stopped. Sweden and some of the other countries in Europe have also said we're walking this back. But here in the US, it's full speed ahead. Right? And so we have all these detransitioners who now, people like Chloe Cole or Prisha Mosley or other people like that, who are increasingly speaking up saying, hey, I was harmed by this. This hurt me, right? And they'll say, like, I was hurting. Why did somebody let me do this? Right? This was me that engaging in self-harm, aided and abetted by the medical community. So, whoa, this is like, clearly it's not leading to human flourishing, right? And so the church's concern about anthropology is borne out in the evidence that we're seeing of the harm that this is causing to these young people. But there are other reasons to be concerned. As Catholics, we want to hand on our faith. And if our kids are in school learning about this anthropology, they're not learning about their faith. They're learning something that is radically at odds. Well, you'll hear people like Father James Martin say that the church doesn't have clear teaching, and that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I'm going to quickly blitz through some of the statements, but it's been a constant drumbeat of statements since the publication of the Catechism, escalating from 2008 on. Benedict was speaking about it, Francis was speaking about it. But it's important because if you believe gender ideology, I don't even see how you can hold a belief in the incarnation. How do you make sense of that? Because the whole point of the incarnation is that it is premised on this belief that there is a unity of body and soul. And so what Christ endured as physically, as an embodied male, was important for our salvation precisely because of the unity of the person, right? So it touches on so many teachings. We can't pass on our faith if our generation is going to be catechized into this. And so we can see, I mentioned Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. I think you guys are going to have my slides, so if you need to, ask me later. But we can see a constant refrain where our popes keep saying, like, look, there is an ecology of the person. You need to accept your body. You need to accept sexual difference. We need to receive creation as a gift, because otherwise this is a rejection of God as creator. Pope Francis is known for using the phrase ideological colonization. And, once he started talking about that, I was so grateful, because remember I said the genderbread person is being pushed into other countries with USAID. They give them like immunizations and the genderbread person, almost as a condition of trying to condition aid on accepting these beliefs. Well, for Pope Francis, ideological colonization means Western elite cultures coming in, displacing a local community's beliefs with their own belief system. Right? And in particular, he was concerned because of this, right? They have strong family cultures in the developing world. Here we're coming in as Westerners trying to deconstruct the family, trying to queer the developing world. But I would also argue, I think Pope Francis's analysis is insufficient in this way, because it's not just that ideological colonization is taking place in the developing world. There is an intensive effort to colonize our families, to push in elite values and displace the values and beliefs that each of us hold, and our ability to transmit our faith to our children. You see in this is another document, Male and Female, he created them, where the Congregation for Catholic Identity, again, identified these issues and called for teachers and catechists to be able to speak up, to be able to respond to our kids and to repropose Christian anthropology. So the constant message we're getting from the church is, this is not just about kids being harmed, although we know they are. This is far deeper and far more insidious, because this is an anthropological issue. The USCCB, now, like, the poor bishops, the bishops can't win. They either act too much or they don't act enough. They haven't said this, they have said this. But I will tell you, on this issue, our bishops have been almost uniformly, like, obviously there are exceptions who don't speak out, and we're seeing more of them speak out now. But our bishops have been so courageous, and they really were leading the way worldwide with their statements on this. And this is a great example. The USCCB issued a doctrinal note saying, hey, if you're in healthcare, you cannot participate in this. Bishop Conley had an article this morning in the Catholic Thing saying, this is shocking that any Catholic healthcare facilities are attempting to even engage in or participate in this in any way. And their doctrinal note is, I loved it. I thought the anthropology nailed it. It was a Thomistic approach to this. It was so good. But they make the point, a soul can never be in another body, much less in the wrong body. Your soul is for your body. That is the meaning of the unity of the person. So again, these teachings have been crystal clear. And we're seeing this, I could go through, we have on personandidentity.com on our website, which is free. It's a great resource for people. But we see, we have a compilation of all the statements various bishops have been making. And they've been fantastic. Right? I might quibble about some of the language, I might look at it and be like, well, maybe you should have said it this way. But no, they have been strong, to the point, making the anthropological argument, calling out the harm. I'm so proud of how they've risen to this occasion. Now, we just came through an election, and what was amazing was near the end of the election, I've been working on this issue since 2016, and it's the first time I've ever seen a candidate lean into an issue, right? So suddenly we saw, thanks to a groundswell of support, constant work by activists, some of the egregious cases involving women's sports, people leaning in and saying like, hey, this is problematic. Elon Musk is supporting the Republicans in large part because his own son identifies as a young woman and has rejected him. It's a very sad case, but it was the first instance when he was really like woken up, not to use the word woke, but like made aware of the dangers of woke ideology when he saw firsthand the effect on his own child. But we cannot get complacent. It isn't enough to ban transgender medical interventions for children. Why do I say that? Because the UK instituted this review, the CAS review, where they ended up shutting down the gender clinic, and there's been a lively conversation about the harms of medical transition for children. But in our culture of autonomy, for some reason, we're all supposed to accept that if an adult male wants to self-identify his way into a woman's bathroom or into participation in a female activity, or just sort of, go to the workforce and garner accolades as breaking the glass ceiling, we're all supposed to be okay with that. And that's the situation we're seeing in the UK, right? So the UK shut down their gender clinic, but it's not over. They are still battling. So here's a case where this young woman she was banned from attending any of these sports. They brought her case up before the local magistrate. Why? She's a girl who is on the spectrum who saw a man playing who had a beard. And she said to him, "Are you a man?" And they are crucifying her. 17-year-old girl with autism. They are going after her viciously. The woman who tweeted this, Sal Grover, now she's from Australia, and Australia is off the rails on this issue. But Sal Grover she developed an app for women, a space for women where women could have conversations, and she called it Giggle, right? And it was a super popular app in Australia. Women like to hop onto Giggle and have conversations in a female-only space. Well, a trans activist applied 3 times to join, and she figured out that it was a man. His name, he called himself Roxanne Tickle. So you'll read about this case, Giggle v. Tickle. Well, Giggle is the good person, Tickle is the bad person, right? And in this case, the way it was adjudicated was a judge in Australia declared that if you change your gender marker on your birth certificate, you have changed sex. You, by virtue of changing his birth certificate, Roxanne Tickle is, for all intents and purposes, in the eyes of Australia, and none of us can criticize it, Roxanne Tickle is a woman. That was what this federal judge said. And so you'll see Sal Grover online. I mean, she is heroic. She's a woman who amassed, she became wealthy with this app, and she's putting it all out on this case. She has expended everything, because she has said, this is like civilization here. We are going to the max, but we cannot get complacent, right? Great, I'm excited that we had a candidate who finally leaned into this. But right now we're in a situation where I worry that it's going to be like the post-Dobbs landscape, where you're going to have red states and blue states. You'll have states like the state of Alabama, which not only banned minor gender transitions, but just wrote a scorching brief in the Scarametti case that's being heard before the Supreme Court, right? Alabama exposed all of the fraud that WPATH is perpetrating, right? So Alabama's all in on protecting children. No one's talking about adults, but here in Illinois, it's quite the opposite. Your governor, your attorney general are all in ensuring that this continues. And why wouldn't they? There is so much money being pumped into this. When the Pope talks about ideological colonization, a huge part of it is that this is a financial, like financially, we're being overwhelmed. It's like a David versus Goliath competition. No one who works in this space can get funding for so long. Well, now it's getting a little bit better, but because there are a few like people who are kind of putting everything on the line. But for so long, like, you know, organizations, nonprofits would start to fight it, and they couldn't get any support. No one wanted to be identified with it. Why? Because after the Proposition 8 disaster, when Brendan Ike was unmasked for supporting the pro-marriage referendum and lost his job at Mozilla Firefox, the message was clear: get in line. And that's why you see all of this corporate stuff. Corporations are all in. Why? Because Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU are constantly threatening them with litigation or with giving them bad DEI ratings. So all of these, you'll see these cultural images marketed to kids. They're everywhere. Do not underestimate how intensive this effort is to catechize our kids. They use several different outlets to try to get them. Pornography, the fourth most common search term on Pornhub is trans porn. So pornography is a huge driver of this. It's pervasive in social media for children, and it's being pushed in through the school system, and it almost forms, it's like a conveyor belt marching them to that gender clinic. Okay, so here are just some images from some of the programming marketed to kids, where you will see all these LGBT characters for kids. No age is too young. Here's a screen grab from Blue's Clues, where they had a drag queen pride parade, and you can't see it well on here, but there was one character in this image that had double mastectomy scars. Like marketing this to kids. TikTok, social media, you'll see all these videos of kids with their big reveal, showing off their chest after their double mastectomy. It's so sad. Public education is awash with it. It's being pushed in at every single level, from trainings to the cafeteria workers to school policy at the level of the school district and the state boards of education. And while I think we can, you know, I'm reasonably confident in the red states, you have to be careful. Because like, here's an example, the state of Georgia put through regulation talking about how they were banning woke ideology in schools. But then when you actually look at it, when you dig down into the weeds and look at the details, nothing changed. Nothing changed, right? Same thing with their ban on transgender affirming care for minors. Like, they had this great ban, the other side, it's almost like, it's like theater, right? The other side is like, no, you can't do it. In Georgia, the kind of rhino, some of the rhino politicians were like, we're doing it, we're doing it. But then you look at the details, and what does it say? We're gonna ban transgender affirming care for minors unless it is life-saving care. Well, the central claim is that it's always life-saving care. So you haven't banned a single thing. I spoke in Georgia this past year, and I was talking to parents, and I was like, I have bad news for you. Like, this was window dressing. Nothing has changed. And it made sense to them because there were so many parents dealing with this surge of children interested in transgenderism. So we really have to be holding these red states' feet to the fire. And it is institutional. I mean, this National Association of School Counselors, for example, insists that you cannot tell parents if their child self-identifies at school. You have to keep this information hidden from these parents. And we've seen so much of this in women's sports. Right now, if you're not following college volleyball, follow it. There is a heroic cadre of young women out there who have been systematically forfeiting game after game because one of the college teams has a transgender identifying player. They know what the stakes are because there was a high school girl who still has brain damage from having a ball spiked into her face at 80 miles an hour. Okay, I am going to wrap it up, but I just want to end with Pope Francis again, because he's famous for talking about accompaniment, but what nobody ever notices is that he is on record saying, like, it's not accompaniment unless you're leading them to the truth. And so the central question that we need to keep in mind is, who do we need to accompany? The conversation in the liberal wing of the church is always accompany the person who identifies as LGBT. right? Accompany the trans person, as they would say. But this is affecting everyone. I can't tell you how many families I've met, girls who will not use the bathroom at school because there are boys there, for example. Kids who are silenced in their class, who don't understand how to talk to a friend. Our boys who have been told, like, they're in a culture where they're told that it's being toxic to be male. And so no wonder so many of them are self-identifying. Girls who are dealing with a pornified culture, right? There are so many young people who really need our help. And this, I think, this last image just sums it up, right? This is a tweet I came across from a young woman who identifies as male, who last year posted, she was just having a bad day, and she said, with everything I've been going through, I'm at the point where I wish my life had gone differently and I'd stayed a girl. I wish I'd had someone to help me love myself as I was, because none of this is worth the hell I'm living in now. So if we want to talk about accompaniment, that is our blueprint. We need to help our kids learn to love themselves and to accept the truth about the person, right? Your body is God's gift to you. Being male or female, embodied male or female, is God's gift to you, right? And so lean into this truth that you indeed are wonderfully made. Okay, thank you. Sure. Yep, absolutely. Sorry for keeping you long.
I could listen to this all day. I think this is probably a better seminar than a luncheon talk, because there's just so much material. I remind you again, we post these videos on the internet. Our videographer has told me he has no problem incorporating the slides, and I guess he's talked to you about it, incorporating the slides into the remarks, so you can look it up and see all of the fantastic information. Quick question, we'll take a couple from the audience. How do you break into this conversation with people who are not religious or not interested in hearing the church?
Yeah.
Because that's who we got to talk to, I think.
Right. My recommendation always is begin with the medical harm, right? And that can't be the end of the conversation, because there is this deeper anthropological issue. But especially if you know someone who's transitioning, start planting those seeds. Are you sure? I heard this is badly researched. I heard there's no evidence behind this. I heard these drugs have powerful effects. Then you can move to why do you need to do that, right? Don't challenge, these are kids, they're just struggling, but do you need to do that? Why can't you just be yourself, right? I like you as you are. But the other thing I think that we underestimate is with young people, they kind of get stuck on a topic and they feel like this is going to solve their problem. And sometimes you need to move them away from it and ground them back in reality. Get them off of social media, get them away from if you go down the gender identity rabbit hole with them, you're not helping them. But pull them back to reality, the reality of who they are, what their interests are, how wonderful it is, related to a family member of the same sex who shares that interest, right? You have a boy who likes to act like, oh, did you know Uncle so-and-so, he was an actor too, right? You have a girl who's an athlete. Oh, did you know, your aunt, they didn't have organized athletics, but she was the best athlete I knew, right? So again, just keep pulling them back to reality. That's what we've got to do.
And I won't elaborate, but I just point out that what I had in mind was how do you talk to the parents, because that's the ones who are kind of pushing it. And to your point, I think asking the parents what research they're aware of, as opposed to telling them you've heard bad stuff, might be more effective. But that's just me.
Well, if I can comment on that, my experience with the parents is that once a child makes there's two different buckets of parents, right? You have the parents, the millennial parents of younger kids, and they too had been catechized by social media, right? So just as it's a social contagion among teenagers, it's a social contagion among young, primarily progressive millennial parents, right? Because they're the ones who are getting all in, and then they're pushing their kids. With the older kids, though, what I have in our experience, there is a short window of opportunity where parents are skeptical. And if you can get in there and support those parents and say, trust your instincts, get a second opinion, here's the name of someone I know, are you, this seems really radical when you have all these underlying issues. Why don't you treat the underlying issues? Because these are really invasive surgeries, then go to the medical harm. But there's, when I speak to educators, I always tell them there's a golden window. You have that window of opportunity, and we've seen cases where Catholic schools didn't step up and support the parents, and then the parents end up being convinced they need to do this to save their child.
Thank you. I think the gentleman behind you, Preston.
Yeah, I'm just, the church has the anthropological arguments, and we certainly have the medical harm arguments and things like that. But I've not heard the church come out with, the argument to parents or whatever that these kids need counseling. Now, we all know this stuff is driven by society, so it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. So the cat's kind of out of the bag. But so it's not like everybody needs to go to counseling here, but the kids are they're just being brainwashed in the public schools here. I'm a lobbyist for Illinois Family Institute in Springfield, and the legislation down there is it's bad.
Yeah.
It's all in the public schools, and they're going to do more this next session so you talk to a typical public school kid, they're already brainwashed in this stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking counseling has got to be the way to go.
Not necessarily. I mean, here's the dilemma.
There's counselors that won't. A lot of counselors will reaffirm, right?
Almost all. You're a psychologist, right? So, almost all will affirm.
So I was wondering, what can we do about that? That's to me the.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the central question, right, with the conservative movement, one of our discussions that we've seen in a lot of different areas is that we need to build parallel structures, right? And in this case, the infrastructure is missing because these disciplines, the American Academy of Pediatricians, the American Academy, and the APA have been captured by this. And so, detransitioners showed up at the AAP convention for the last 2 years in a row, and this year the police escorted them off the premises. And all they were doing was saying to pediatricians, let me tell you how this treatment harmed me. They were not allowed to stay and make those points. So has the church spoken up about this? Actually, yes. When you look at the individual pastoral letters, I'm thinking of like Archbishop Coakley's letter in Oklahoma City, or Bishop Burbridge in Arlington, which is like phenomenal, where they talk about how this comes from a mistaken apprehension of who you are, right? And the need to sort of pull it back together and get good counseling. But the problem that we have is that in so many states, because they've passed quote-unquote conversion therapy bans, and then they have they define conversion therapy as any attempt to quote-unquote change a person's perception of their gender identity, it puts these therapists in a bind. They can't advertise this. So all they can do is they can say, I work on trauma, I come from a Christian perspective. Even there, you got to know your counselor. So the first step for a group like yours is to begin to identify good counselors. And the other problem we have is that you can't create a list, because anything you put in writing is potentially discoverable. And then these are physicians who could lose their license. So my advice to churches, to schools, is know your people. Identify the counselors, the medical people in your community who can help, know who they are, and protect them, right? And then when you have an issue, you can say, I know a therapist who can help you, right? And he deals with the underlying trauma, right? What you can't do is put in an email, oh, this is a therapist who will help you change your understanding of your gender identity, because then that therapist will lose their license. I have had the experience of speaking with therapists. Like, this is such a real thing. I gave one talk once with this therapist who was absolutely the most lovely person. I would trust her with any of my kids. But I realized as I was watching her, she was tightly clutching her rosary and shaking, because she was a young person who was the breadwinner for her family. And I was like, that was the moment when I thought, we cannot put this burden on the backs of the psychologists. We've got to protect them. We've got to be pushing back against all kinds of SOGI legislation. The bishops have been pushing back against the SOGI efforts, sexual orientation, gender identity efforts, but it's going to have to, we're going to have to do grassroots evangelization. And when I use the Dobbs comparison, it was intentional, because if you think about what happened in the wake of Dobbs, we sort of like thought that politics could solve it, and we didn't address the underlying spiritual problem. And that's what we got to do here. That's why we've got to make an anthropological argument in addition to the medical harm argument, because we're also not protecting our older kids. But that's the only way. We've got to be able to provide such a groundswell of understanding that this is harmful to the person, that then it's going to be okay for a therapist to openly oppose it.
I just, a quick comment on that as well. One, and maybe you can shed some light on this. My impression is that one glimmer of hope in this argument is, ironically perhaps, the legal profession. I'm seeing malpractice lawsuits brought against doctors who, the allegation would be they had failed to properly advise the patient of the risks of going forward. Are you seeing? Because that's going to slow down. That's going to slow down this freight train right away, I think, if any of those actually go forward.
Well, yeah. The problem with relying on medical malpractice litigation is, number one, these kids are signing all kinds of consent forms. We have the mature minor doctrine, which says that they can consent, so it's hard to make the argument that they can't. And the statute of limitations for medical malpractice is pretty narrow when you figure most of them, the ones who detransition, it's generally a period of time between 4 to 6 years. Someone like Chloe Cole is very unusual. Most of these young people, it takes fully almost 6 years, and by then the clock has run out. So the first thing we need to do is remove the limitations, allow them to sue for a decade, full decade. Right? That happened in the state of Missouri, and it was the reason why the gender clinic closed in St. Louis at their children's hospital, and they put out a statement and said the legal risk to us is unacceptable. And that was why they closed. So yes, that is a bright spot, but it's not going to happen unless we aggressively change the statute of limitations.
Impressive.
To that question, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? What do you recommend be answered?
I mean, this is actually a real issue, because sometimes we speak to communities that are communities of immigrants, people who have English as a second language, people who are poor, they have a high school education, right? So they're at a real disadvantage, right? Because they feel like they have to go along, they don't know what to do. But they're also terrified of a CYS investigation, right? And so, or CPS, whatever it is here. So my recommendation is always to say to the therapist, thank you very much. This is a lot to think about. We need to go home and discuss it. If they want to make an appointment, say, I need to check my calendar. I'll call you back. Leave and never go back. And in fact, there are cases where families have moved out of state because they're so worried that they will have triggered an investigation, not just at the clinic, but because the schools are involved, right? And so you have the schools policing and following up, and you've got the school counselor like, hey, why haven't you transitioned your child, right? When are you going to go to the gender clinic? So we have to be smart about it. You can just say, like, it's a lot to think about. We need to have time to digest. I always tell people, you don't have to like wave the flag and say, I'm not transitioning my child. Don't join the fight until your child's safe. Then you can come and be with us and fight with us and be on our side. And that's what we're seeing. We now have parents who have safely gotten their kids through this, but it took a lot. It took a lot. It took moving schools, moving school districts, moving states, moving across the country, disassociating your child from counselors, leaving the doctors, leaving pediatrician practices. Like you have to, it's a battle, and you've got to be prepared to be aggressive in saving your child, but you've got to be smart. So that's my recommendation.
I'd also add again that on each of these. I suspect, and I'm not sure, we're not seeing it already, you're going to see a huge migration from public schools to private schools, which is a huge opportunity for the Catholic Church if we take advantage of it. And that means keeping the stuff out of the Catholic schools and being very aggressive about defending that. And it brings me to another point that I can't emphasize enough. Where the battle is going to be fought, I think, is under the First Amendment freedom of religion argument. They're going to come after us on all fronts, and they're going to say, "Oh, we're not attacking your faith. We just want you to keep it out of the public square." And of course, that's a complete contradiction of terms, and it defeats the whole purpose of even having religious freedom.
Yeah.
So keep an eye on that one also. We'll take maybe one more,
Okay.
or two more, maybe.
Kevin, very interesting you brought that up. So, have you recently heard about what happened in Western Pennsylvania with the book Jacob's New Dress?
Yes, that's a school district right by us.
Oh, okay, so a few years ago, I met him.
Yeah, the question was, there was litigation in Western Pennsylvania where parents of kindergartners sued because a teacher came in and read a book called Jacob's New Dress to them, and they said it interfered with their right to direct the education and upbringing of their children, and a judge upheld their, agreed with them. So that was a real loss for the other side, but I know it's going to be appealed.
But the legal issue here is, so a few years ago, I met a woman at the Young Adult Ministry Catholic Christmas party. We went on a date, and she worked at a publishing company, Albert Whitman and Company, in Park Ridge. They published that book. And I asked her, how do you reconcile your Catholic faith with that? She goes, well, I'm not going to worry about our CEO's Catholic. Well, long story short, I reported the Veritas Protecting God's Children people, the Archdiocese. And the women down there said, well, we only see this as a potential problem, don't email us on this anymore. And so she and the youth minister had me reported to the Schaumburg Police Department, for harassment because I'm harassing the abuser. And even though I'm a coach and I've been a teacher, I'm supposed to be a mandatory reporter.
Yeah.
And so I got fined $100. I got a $100 citation, although the detective wouldn't come out of his office and meet with me because he was too embarrassed, as one of my other friends in law enforcement said. I eventually went to Bishop Rassus in Vicariate 1, and he went down to the St. Cecilia's in Mount Prospect and banned her from having anything to do with children in the diocese, because you can't be publishing those stuff, because she volunteered at a Catholic youth group.
Yeah.
Like, you can't be doing it, but that goes to show you some of the battles going on
Right.
now. And so when I saw that article this past week, I go, this is exactly what I was fighting against just a few years ago.
Yes.
And at the source.
Well, and so the interesting thing about what you raised, and this is again why our bishops keep making the anthropological argument, we don't have a religious liberty defense unless we make that argument that this is something that cuts to the heart of our faith.
When I told the detective in an email, I said, this isn't your realm of authority. This goes to the bishop. It's a First Amendment issue. He goes, well, it's gone to the point where I have to find you otherwise I'm going to arrest you.
It's nothing surprises me, but you know what?
They're not trained properly on how to deal with it.
Yeah.
What I've been told by my other friends in law enforcement.
I mean, you're lucky in the UK. You would be in jail.
Yeah, and keeping track, again, as always, I plug our website. We try to keep track of these kinds of issues as they come up in the news from all kinds of sources. If you hear about something in the news from like a suburban newspaper or something rather obscure, let us know and we'll post it. You really have to stay up on this. John, last question.
How do you explain what appears to be a apparent contradiction? The Pope's strong statements in this matter, and yet he does his actions publicly, strongly publicly, do not seem to support his bull.
Yeah,
Repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, on the one hand, you have the Pope making strong statements, and then on the other hand, you have his actions, where his actions seem at odds with his statements on this issue, right? And this is part of, for lack of a better word, like the conundrum of Pope Francis, which is, at the end of the day, he calls himself a son of the church. He'll line up They'll go up to the line and then go back. I had I've spoken to some of the Jesuits about this, and they said he's surrounded by people. First of all, he's not a theologian, right? He knows what's, like, but he has this intuitive sense, like, this ideology is bad, you shouldn't be teaching it. But he's not a theologian, and he came of age. He's the classic quintessential baby boomer, loosey-goosey, afraid of rigid Catholics, right? Like, the only people that he feels comfortable judging are rigid seminarians, right? And Latin mass goers, apparently. And, like, but, I mean, I think it's a problem, because I think, like, unfortunately, everyone, I've talked to people, I have some friends who are in business, and they're like, everyone needs to have that person who can say to you, like, who can challenge you on this and say, hey, hold on a minute, this doesn't line up with what you're saying. And I just don't think he's surrounded by people who do. I think he has people around him. The Jesuits are pushing Father James Martin. The Jesuits, in terms of theology, not all. I've got some very good friends I have friends who are Jesuits, right? Like, isn't that the inclusive statement? No, I have friends who are Jesuits. But I mean, like, the Jesuit tradition of theology, my father was educated in a Jesuit, had a Jesuit education. There's nothing finer when it's done right. There's nothing better than, like, a Jesuit theologian who is thinking with the heart and mind of the church. But unfortunately, I think there are many, many who are distracted by, bad theology. And so when you read what they're putting out, it's just bad theology. I honestly, I don't pay attention to that in this sense, which is that whatever Pope Francis does that causes, the only reason why it's causing confusion is because we now have TV cameras trained on him. But it doesn't affect the transmission of our faith. And I am very confident about the direction of the church, the next conclave. We have so many clear statements on this issue. We have all the medical stuff lining up that in some cases, I look at it, I get a little frustrated because I think it's a distraction. And I kind of think he's got a big heart, and I think he's being exploited by people around him who are taking advantage of his big heart and his generous impulses and his desire to be the slum priest, and they're manipulating it and using it for political purposes.
I don't agree with that. I think, I was talking to a person who's aware of the public reaction, Catholic and non-Catholic. It is very contradictory, and people accept the contradiction, not the what he has said.
Yeah, I mean, like, there have been a lot of analyses of Pope Francis where they point out that he was formed in Peronist politics, right? And so, like, that's kind of the Argentinian way. I actually find him as a pope to be one of our most provincial popes. He has, like, his statements about the United States, for example, betray a real ignorance about, like, the state of the church in this country. His actions with China betray a real naivete about the Chinese communists and their determination. And in all of those cases, you have people behind the scenes in the Vatican also kind of slotting him into these things. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I take what I can get. His statements are what is going to be part of the tradition of the church. And I'm a medievalist, so I know there were plenty of popes who had all kinds of things going on. And I think that's what keeps me sane, honestly. I really do think that's what keeps me sane, my medieval background. So.
Thank you very much. We have a nice roster of speakers coming up. If you haven't come to these luncheons before, I hope you'll come again. We are on the second Friday of every month. In December, we have Dan Sheely talking about, it's kind of a Christmas presentation. We got Francis Mayer coming up, John Severance also, just a lot of very good speakers, and I urge you to keep track. If you haven't subscribed to our website, subscribe, make sure you're on our email list, and keep track of what's coming up because they are really, really good. Thank you so much for coming.